Hey everyone, this is Slovakian Patriot here. So today I'm going to tell you a story about an antique Mercedes-Benz truck. My grandfather, World War II, the Nazis and the Red Army. So my grandfather on my father's side, his name was Jozef. He grew up, he was born in 1910, and he grew up without his father. His father passed away in Bolivia. He went over there to work, and as many immigrants tended to do back then, he'd go to the New World, whether it's South America or the United States, Canada, whatever, work in a mine, something along those lines, save up a bunch of money, and then head back home. My great-grandfather never made it home. He was murdered in Bolivia after he withdrew his money from the bank, but before he boarded the ship to return. So my grandfather had to work as a little child along with his brother. You know, back then, of course, child labor was not, it wasn't the stigma that we have nowadays. That was quite normal, but my grandfather grew up working very hard and with a very minimal education as a result of this. He built his own house with his own two hands and eventually had a team of Clydesdales, and him and his brother would buy up all the local produce, all the fruits, vegetables, apples, peaches, walnuts, anything they could get their hands on at a reasonable price, and they'd ship it out to the city. And of course the profit was much better out there, and this was essentially what my grandfather did for most of his life. But in the 1930s, he recognized, when he was in his early 20s, in the 1930s, he recognized that the best way to make more money and to make his business grow, be more successful, he was quite successful already, but the best way to do even better would be to buy a truck, replace the horses. He sold the horses, remortgaged his house, which he had built with his own two hands and didn't own a penny on, but he got out alone, and him and his brother, together with their life savings and all the money from selling these Clydesdales, they bought a Mercedes-Benz truck. Not because it was a status symbol, because it was the best, most durable, most, it had the reputation of being the best vehicle out there, which it was at that era. So of course I've always wanted a Mercedes-Benz because of that, and that's a separate side note. This is my diesel WWII chassis, 5-cylinder turbo diesel, 1985 Mercedes-Benz, the very last year they made them. In Europe they stopped making these in '84. But I bought one of these years ago because I just always wanted one, because of my grandfather, because he had that Mercedes truck. And I kind of fell in love with Mercedes-Benz afterwards. I always thought they were overpriced and kind of ridiculous, and then I realized they're just an amazingly well-made vehicle. At least they were back then. But the story of my grandfather's Mercedes-Benz truck, I'm not sure what model year it was, by the way, something in the mid-30s, maybe 34. The story of his truck is somewhat tragic. The Nazis came and went, of course. The Munich Agreement happened. World War II happened. It was a mess. The one thing that happened that nobody really expected in my family was that when the Red Army came through to rescue us from the Nazis, they stole my grandfather's truck at the point of a gun. They essentially told him, you have a choice. We can either take your truck because you relinquish your keys and nobody dies, or we'll, something along the lines of, we'll shoot you, drive the truck over your dead body, as invading armies tend to do. So my grandfather lost his truck, but of course the debt remained. His bills magically didn't go away, and his mortgage was still there. And now it was a lot tougher to make money. Well, how do you make money shipping fruits and vegetables back and forth from the small towns to the city if you now don't have the horses and you don't have a truck? It's damn near impossible. But the funny thing is, my grandmother used to talk about how when the Germans came through, we got lucky and we didn't see any of the psycho Nazis in my town. So the irony, of course, is that now in the 21st century, the beginning of the 21st century, 7-8 decades after all this stuff happened, people recognize the evil of the Third Reich and the Nazis. but we have a bunch of kids here in America, especially other Western countries, where there's some sort of a cognitive dissonance going on, where people have no idea what they're talking about when they praise or apologize for communism. There's college kids running around with Soviet flags, flags of the USSR or Antifa flags or whatever, and it's rather disturbing. The irony is that my grandmother had these stories about how the German soldiers came through, and when they would come through town, they would come into my grandmother's house and ask for food, and she'd feed them. They'd have a bowl of soup, or whatever. They'd have a plate of food, and they would usually leave a tip on the table, and it amounted to more than the cost of the food, or sometimes even would cover for her labor if she was to calculate that. And so they were a nuisance, and they certainly weren't welcome. People weren't thrilled about the German invasion. But in my particular hometown, my relatives didn't have a horrific experience with rape, torture, and theft as far as the Germans go. Many of these guys, of course, were conscripted soldiers who probably didn't want to be there to begin with. I sure as hell know if I was born in Germany in the 19-teens or 1920s, and now I'm in the military and I'm being forced to march on Russia. No thanks. But that being said, the Red Army came through, and, well, we all know what happened. Or at least if you don't, then look it up. But my grandfather's truck being stolen crushed him as a person. And it was, I can't even imagine going through that hardship. That being said, he was an amazing person, and never, not once do I remember him being angry or spiteful or resentful. Perhaps he was just happy that his family all got to live and live through the war. It was terrible times in the 1940s. But that's my story, and that's sort of, I always wanted a Mercedes for that reason. And then you buy one and you start to work on them. You start turning wrenches and you realize they're very well made. I love these cars. But I think more importantly, the life lesson is that you should never look the other way for political, to excuse a certain political ideology. The fact that some people turn a blind eye to the evils of communism, but they'll preach and scream about fascism or any kind of right-wing ideology is just insane to me. And that's just one little facet of, my family's history and as it pertains to the communists. Later on, I'm going to tell you guys about 1968 and my father's experiences with that. My parents were both alive for that, and they both experienced the Red Army and once again the Russians coming through. And by the way, I'd like to end on a quick note here. A lot of people in the past my friends or acquaintances have asked me, geez, well, you really hate Russians then, don't you? And I would say, what makes you think that? Oh, well, all these horrible things that the communists did. And I would tell them, well, no, just like with the Nazis, it's not the Russians that are the problem, same as with the Nazis and the Germans are the problem. It's a fanatical political ideology where people abandon logic and reason. That's the problem. I hate Nazis. I hate communists. I don't necessarily hate a German person or a Russian person, same as I wouldn't hate a random Cambodian I meet, which I've met thousands of. Pol Pot was a psycho. The average Cambodian living in Lowell, Massachusetts, where there's thousands of them, are not the problem. So that's that. I'm going to drive off in this thing and show you guys how it rolls coal in the meantime. I don't know if you're not into cars, it just means it blows a bunch of soot out the exhaust pipe, which this one's a little more custom than most. We've got the flapper on here. Talk to you guys next time.